Good morning out there in PT land. This is Morgan Denny for the PT on Ice Daily Show, coming to you from Portland, Oregon, out on the West Coast. Today we're going to talk about the fact that you have to ask the question. So, as an experienced clinician, I think one of the biggest benefits to us is having a lot of experience, right? One of the things that helps us to do is really filter down on how many questions we need to ask during a subjective exam, right? We all remember being a new grad and asking 5,000 more questions than we ever needed to because we didn't know at that point which questions led to important answers or which answers led to different questioning, right? So we weren't very efficient. But by being able to ask a lot of those questions, we did gather a lot of information. And of course, that's how we learned some of those patterns, those clusters of symptoms, is by being able to ask that question so many times and realize that with certain diagnoses, they never say yes, and with certain ones, they say no. So that's one of the main ways that we really get good and more efficient, because honestly, who has the time to ask all those questions to every patient? But I think there's something to be said for asking more questions and really diving a little bit deeper with patients, because as we get a little bit more experienced and sometimes a little bit more cavalier about going down all of those roads from a subjective perspective, we do start to miss out on some pieces. I mean, how many times have you had a patient come in like visit 3 that you're treating for low back pain and they might mention, oh yeah, I just remembered I had a fusion. Is that important? Or the patient that comes in and mentions like swelling in their feet that you had never discussed before. And to us, we're like, oh, how could you have not told me this is so relevant? But it's not the patient's, responsibility. It's not up to them to know these questions to ask. They don't really know what's pertinent to their foot and ankle pain. They don't know what would or wouldn't affect your treatment decisions when it comes to their shoulder and how it's going to move. But it's up to us to be sure that we're always asking some of these questions. I've had a lot of PTs come to me with patient questions recently. And when I'm asking them about some of the things that the patient has said, a lot of them say, well, they didn't say that they had dizziness. Well, they didn't mention that they had ringing in their ears. But I think it's important for us to distinguish between a patient needing to mention something and them actually denying that it's true, right? It's not enough to say like, well, they didn't say that wasn't true, because patients don't know what is or isn't important. We as clinicians need to know all of these questions to ask and when it's appropriate so that we can follow up with this kind of questioning so that they can either deny that symptom is there or is current or that they've ever had it before, or so that we know that it's on board and we might need to change our questioning strategy. The other thing I think is that as clinicians, we haven't yet gotten comfortable with asking medical questions. It's as if it's not quite in our realm. So people have gotten away from changes in bowel and bladder because they feel like that is too medical, it's so diagnostic. I have had so many students, when you get to that question in the subjective exam, they get a little bit mumbly. I wonder why. It's like people aren't very comfortable saying poop and pee, bowel and bladder, urine, all of those words. See, I said all of them on the internet and I'm still alive. But we need to get more comfortable, because if we're asking patients some of these questions where we know the underlying pathology and etiology and the reasoning behind why we're asking these questions, if we don't do it in a comfortable, confident way, it doesn't allow patients to be able to be upfront and honest with us when they're answering some of these questions. They're more likely to not give you the information or to withhold some of the information if you're uncomfortable, because then they're just going to make you more uncomfortable, which will make the whole thing more uncomfortable. So important that with some of these medical questions, and as we get better with them, we ask them comfortably and confidently so that our patients can understand that that's what we're portraying for them to mirror it back to us. So being able to ask those questions in a really comfortable way is important, to not mumble, to not stutter, to not rush through them, because some of those questions are there for a reason, right? Like we know that bowel and bladder changes are on that subjective because they're going to point us to some really less fun pathology when it comes to lumbar issues. So it's on there because it's been studied, but we need to make sure to reiterate, right? Like some patients will go through questions like that and they won't necessarily mark anything because they're like, well, I mean, it's been a little hard to pee, but that's not what they're talking about because we're talking about my back. They don't know. So it's important that we actually go through and ask some of these questions. Additionally, I think, as we get more comfortable and we've built our clustering of symptoms, we forget that sometimes this stuff can be underlying. Like even as an experienced clinician, there are times where I find myself in evaluation being like, oh, you have pain when you roll over in bed. Oh, totally SI joint. And then what I'm doing in my head is I'm taking the cluster of subjective things that I know and have heard from so many SI joint patients over the years, and I'm just bombarding that person with them, right? I'm saying, okay, do you have this? What about this? What about this? And the reason that I'm doing that is not because I totally doubt they have SI joint pain, but I want to make sure that their symptoms match the rest of the cluster. Because if they match the rest of the cluster, if I ask all those questions that seem redundant, then that's fine. Then they probably are an SI joint patient. But if I start asking a bunch of those questions that fit in the cluster and there's a lot of no's in there, then that tells me I need to maybe move on to a different hypotheses that I can either rule in or rule out. But if I don't know some of those questions to ask, I'm never going to be capable, right? So how do we get more comfortable and more confident with the questions we have? Like how do we learn more of these questions that we can cluster so that we can make sure we're ruling in or ruling out certain pathologies? Part of it's just knowledge, right? Like as a baby clinician, I hated when people said you just need experience, but some of it is truly that. You just need experience so that you can hear the same kinds of reports over and over and they become kind of solidified in your mind. But the other side of it is you need to pay attention because people can tell you stuff all the time. And if you don't start associating those cluster of things together, then they don't become important. They don't hold the same weight. The other thing is, honestly, as PTs who are in direct access communities and PTs who are seeing a lot of patients in a primary care type of setting, we need to be better with some of these medical questions. Like I had a new patient this last week who came in with bilateral lower extremity type symptoms, who obviously had some vascular issues going on. Vascular stuff can cause lower extremity pain. This is not an outrageous case, and I was definitely not magically intelligent for knowing this or understanding this. She had swelling in her feet and ankles, easy bruising, her cuts bled long, and even though she didn't mark cardiac on her intake sheet when I went through her pharmaceuticals list, there were several blood pressure meds and one for angina. So even though she didn't report cardiac issues, even though she didn't know she had a history of this stuff, for some further questioning and asking about that stuff really revealed that this was a piece. I mean, she'd already seen her PCP and an ortho in the last 2 weeks. None of them picked up on this, but it's because that patient goes through and marks their history. And if people aren't kind of going through it and actually asking and screening out some of this stuff, you can miss this because it looks like, oh yeah, she's just got a bilateral tendon kind of problem. Yeah, she might, but she's also got some crazy inflammatory response going on and nothing is creating circulatory return in the way it should because she's got venous insufficiency, right? So we need to be able to ask these questions, and it's difficult, right? It's difficult to know, how do I know what questions are important? And I think part of that is just getting experience, getting some understanding, and then start asking like 3 basic background questions to every patient. Make it sort of a habit. So there are patients that you might ask 3 cardiac questions to, and they can be all sorts of stuff. Any issues with blood pressure in the past, right? Could be any swelling in your feet and ankles, any coldness that's developed in your feet and hands, any of that kind of stuff, any history of angina. But take those questions and start asking them to every patient, right? That way you get experience. That way you start hearing some answers and you can begin clustering your symptoms, even if they don't relate to that person's hip pain. It's okay. You can gain experience by just asking the question and getting comfortable with it. But I think as a group, as a profession, we really need to get better at asking some of these questions and understanding what our clusters mean so that we can get these patients to the right provider, number one, and also the right treatment. Because when you ask that question, when that one piece of information comes out that you weren't expecting, it can change the entire trajectory of your treatment or of your objective evaluation if you're in the subjective. So even though sometimes I think it doesn't seem efficient to ask a lot more questions, I think it's actually imperative as PTs that we start doing that. Asking more questions, checking off the boxes so that in our head when we have the cluster of the 20 types of reports that people make about the diagnosis that we're thinking is on board, that we check those boxes. Because if we're not checking those boxes and then following it up with another box, all of our objective boxes, and making sure things match, then something else is going on. And we need to be able to dive into that. So remember, patients aren't going to tell you everything you need to know. You need to be able to ask the question. And as detectives, which we already are as PTs, like we are really good at thinking about what our next step or our next treatment choice is or our next question, while also maintaining a friendly conversation with our patient. We're good at this kind of stuff, but to be really good at clinical reasoning, I feel like we need to get back to asking more of those questions and make sure we're not just relying on the patients to give us all the information they need. With that said, you can catch me on VICE tonight if you're part of VICE, Virtual ICE, talking about primary care and PT. If you're not a part of Virtual ICE, I'm just going to plug it because I think it might be probably the most magical and monetarily efficient way to get CEUs and get some really good con ed. This is a weekly 1-hour lecture by all of the ICE faculty that bring you varying topics. So if you're like me and you're not great at paying attention for a really, really long time with good focus, this is a wonderful way to learn stuff. It's also a good way to open up your mind to different aspects of PT and different types of treatment strategies or specialty areas like dance and PT, geriatrics, like anything. It's all represented on VICE for a very, very low price right there on VICE. See, I'm a Dr. Seuss. So catch me on VICE tonight or catch me at a class somewhere else. But have a great day, you guys, and do good things for your patients out in the world.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to the PT on Ice Daily Show. If you enjoyed this content, head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. And be sure to check us out on Facebook and Instagram at the Institute of Clinical Excellence. If you're interested in getting plugged into more ICE content on a weekly basis while earning CEUs from home, check out our Virtual ICE online mentorship program at ptonice.com. While you're there, sign up for our Hump Day Hustling newsletter for a free email every Wednesday morning with our top 5 research articles and social media posts that we think are worth reading. Head over to ptonice.com and scroll to the bottom of the page to sign up.